Well, good evening, Lee. How you going, mate?
I'm good, Greg. Stuck in Melbourne, but we are well and truly on the downhill run to being able to get out and go fishing.
Yeah, on the downhill run or on the uphill run, depending how you look at it. So
Oh, yeah.
it's been going downhill, now it's leveling out, mate.
Yeah, it's about where it's at, mate. We just need everyone to do the right thing for a couple more weeks and
Yeah,
hopefully it'll be, back on the water. But you know what? We've missed out for a long time, but saying that, thankfully, it's been through the winter months and we are right on the cusp of snapper season now. So fingers crossed we'll be on the water at the right time.
yeah, that's it. At least if you're going to come back from, being locked down, you're going to come back at a time when the fish might be biting and there's, something to go out there and chase. And perhaps the fish have had a bit of a rest as well, as we discussed in a podcast earlier today, that they might be a little bit less pressured at the moment.
Yeah, no doubt. Look, and I'm sure there's all that sort of stuff that comes into play, especially, these fish have had a big rest, even the squid and all that sort of things. And the recreational catch of squid down here in Port Phillip Bay and Western Port is huge. It's actually bigger than the commercial catch. So, all those fish come in, the squid spawn, the squid breed, and that makes more food and makes the wheels turn.
Yep, for sure. So, guys, for those that have just joined us, please, make yourselves known. Just jump on the chat there. Let us know that you can hear us okay, and let us know where you're coming from and what your interests are. So, we're going to be talking about snapper today. We're going to be talking about how Lee uses his Simrad technology to find snapper and to target them, find the actively feeding fish and all that kind of stuff. And we're going to focus on Port Phillip Bay and Western Port Bay down in Lee's backyard in Melbourne, which a little bit out of bounds at the moment, but not for long, hopefully, as we've just discussed. So hopefully things are turning around. So, guys, what we're going to be talking about also will apply anywhere in Australia. So if you're a snapper fisher anywhere in southern Australia, a lot of this stuff is still going to be applicable.
Yep.
And if you've got questions specifically to other locations, or Lee's fished all over the country, so feel free to fire those questions through. And don't feel limited either to just sonar questions. You're quite welcome to ask questions more generally about snapper fishing.
Without doubt.
Yeah. So Zdenko's having a few problems. The internet there is very slow. Sorry about that, mate. So we've got Kevin from Traralgon. We've got Michael from Tassie. Guy has tagged a few people as well. Good on you, Guy. So we've got lots of people starting to come on board. I'm not going to go through all the names.
Yep.
Jack says he loves the podcast today. Can't wait to hear more about the Simrad tips. So good on you, Jack. So glad a few people have heard the podcast. And hopefully we can add a little bit more on the sort of nuts and bolts of sonar and that kind of thing. So
well, hopefully, Craig. And I suppose that we spoke about in the podcast that, there's something like 7 different strains of snapper throughout the country, but snapper is snapper. And while they vary from area to area, the basics of snapper fishing are probably, very, very similar. And, what we do down here does work in other parts of the country, and in fact, it's absolutely deadly in other parts of the country. And same thing saying that one of my favourite ways to fish up the coast in New South Wales is with a floating bait. You anchor up your burley and you fish a floating bait, even in 50 metres of water, and it's deadly because the snapper come up off the water, off the bottom. And we do the same thing down here, and it works just as well. So these tips and whatever will work for everybody everywhere.
And I think as we had our chat for the podcast as well, mate, you were talking about the difference, and we might go through this before we even start with our sonar masterclass tonight, but you were talking about the differences between Western Port Bay and Port Phillip Bay, and they're very, very different fisheries despite being geographically close together. And I said to you during the podcast interview, look, it reminds me so much of Moreton Bay, where parts of Moreton Bay are a bit like Port Phillip. It's not a lot of tidal movement, but there is a rise and fall. Other parts, you've got this roaring tidal current, and so they fish very differently. Same snapper strain there, I believe, in that bay, but but very, very different in terms of how you target them.
Yeah, for sure, and that's the great thing. There's no one way to catch them, and that's what I do love about it. But it's nice when I think you can go somewhere, Greg, and you can go, hey, this worked in Port Phillip Bay, and I'm up here in Evans Head, but we've got a similar scenario, and things sort of look the same, or I'm going to try the same thing that worked down there. Same thing, you could be coming from Southwest Rocks. We've got Graham Allen there, and tips and things that he would do at Southwest Rocks, they will work down here. So, and it's cool when you can just go, I remember that time that worked there. I'm going to throw that in, and quite often it does work.
Yeah, well, before we do start off, mate, let's have a bit of a chat about your backyard. I know a lot of people that are coming in tonight are going to be very interested in the Melbourne scene. But as I said, we will talk about other areas as well. But let's have a bit of a chat about Western Port Phillip, because it really is a very interesting story, and I've heard it now from a couple of different Vic anglers. And talk to us, mate, about what the differences are between those two fisheries. They're both great fisheries in
Yeah,
their own right, but very different.
they really are. They're wonderful fisheries. They're very interesting fisheries too. So the majority of the fish that come into Port Phillip Bay come, they're born in there, they go out and they head to the west, so down towards Portland and places like that. So, guys know those sorts of locations.
Mm.
Something like 70% of the fish that come back into the bay are from that west, whereas once you start to go to Western Port, you get a bit of a mix, but there's definitely more of an eastern sort of strain. And then when you go down to places like Welsh Pool and Lakes Entrance, you've got a genuine eastern strain of snapper, or an East Gippsland strain of snapper, and they do look different. It's really quite interesting that you can see a photo of a fish and you can go, I reckon that's come out of Welsh Pool or Gippsland, or I reckon. So, but what's interesting, Port Phillip Bay, if people don't know, it's one of the biggest bays in the world, okay, but it's got no or minimal tide for the majority of the bay. Down in the entrance, it has a huge amount of tide, and it's basically because Port Phillip Bay is round like a bowl, shallow on the edges, 20-odd metres deep in the middle. But when it comes to the water getting in and out, it's like pulling the plug out of the bath. So you have this tiny little entrance, which is the rip, and you have all this water trying to get in and out of there on the tide changes. And on big southerly winds, it can actually bottle the water up in the bay, and the bay level will actually rise because the water comes in on the run-in tide but can't get out properly on the run-out tide. So makes for a very interesting piece of water. You jump over the peninsula, and it's basically this finger of land. You've got Port Phillip Bay on one side, Western Port on the other, and you go to this completely different scenario where you've got a long sort of channel that winds up. You've got Phillip Island, oh my earphone fell out. You've got Phillip Island across the front of it. There's two entrances to Western Port, one big one small one. And it's a tidal piece of water that's very different. It's full of sandbars and mud banks, and but it's a wonderful fishery in its own right.
Yeah. All right, mate. We've got a few questions already starting to come through, and I know you've got a few screenshots that we can work through as well, but maybe I'll just wander back up through the questions. Thanks, guys, for everyone who's chatting, by the way, and letting us know that you can hear us. That's always good, because it's very difficult when you're doing these things and you can't see the audience, you can't see read the body language, you don't know whether people are hearing you okay. So we do appreciate that. So we've got Mark Cotton. He's interested in his deep water snapper fishing in New Zealand, 90 metres.
Wow.
So perhaps we could touch on some aspects of fishing in deeper water. Jack, love the podcast today. Can't wait to hear more about Simrad. Well, you're in the right place for that, Jack. What have we got? Real salty fishing. South Australian no snapper for another 2 years. Very sad, but guys, wait till you get back into it.
It's the long term.
You get back into it. Yeah,
that's right. It's a 2 years is a long time, but I think the state of their fishery, it was a necessary thing to be done, and fingers crossed it will make it better than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it's tough. I mean, I do feel for you guys, but also I look over at Western Australia where there's been some fairly tough laws put in place, and the quality of snapper fishing over there now is just off the planet. So plenty to look forward to there. So we've got Andrew Lorriman from Port Stephens, who's wanting to know the best way to target snapper on slow jigs.
Yeah,
I don't know if you've got any screenshots in particular that might talk about that.
Yeah, we do. So the great thing about snapper, Greg, I think, is that, for a long time and growing up even as a kid, you thought they were such a bottom-feeding predator that mooched around and didn't do a lot. They are actually quite a super predator. Yep. They're a big, strong fish with a big, strong mouth, and they can eat everything from crabs and mussels and oysters off the bottom through to chasing and chowing down live slimy mackerel, no problem at all. In fact, one of my favourite baits in Gippsland is a big slimy mackerel. Like, I'm talking not far off the size that you will use for a marlin bait. And when they eat them, they eat them. I remember seeing some phenomenal footage from years ago when Matt Watson had one of his first videos that came out of snapper fishing in New Zealand, and this 20-odd, they had underwater footage of 20-odd pound snapper just eating a live salmon, and it was brutal the way they attacked them, and that's just how they do it. They're quite a predator, and with our good electronics these days, mate, like, I have no problem at all marking snapper sitting 10 metres from the surface in 50 metres of water. So it's changed how we fish.
It's a case of realising that they're snapper, I think, isn't it? Because I think for a lot of years, snapper fishers would go past those fish that were sitting mid-water, and they'd be targeting the stuff they could see down the bottom, assuming that maybe it was kingfish or some other species was up higher in the water column, and it's actually snapper.
Yeah, it is, exactly. And I think they're also a bit of a predator that likes to just, they're a bit sly, and he lets a lot of the fish do the other work. And you'll even see it here in the bay. You get a school of salmon, and they're chowing down on the bait fish on the surface, and all the seagulls and all the birds are going. and the snapper is sitting under the salmon school. And if you let your plastic or your jig sink deeper, you pluck a big snapper doing that. So they're a bit opportunistic as well. And the great thing is that nowadays with this slow jigging, and obviously soft plastics are just phenomenal for catching snapper, especially up the coast, but jigging is just such a good thing. And there's a couple of factors that I really like about slow jigging, Greg, is it's slow. It doesn't require a lot of effort. So the gear you use is nice and light, so you can do it all day long. You don't have to actually worry about, getting tired and all that sort of stuff. But also it's very, very good if you're driving around and you mark fish. And in fact, I've had some great fishing up off Coffs Harbour 2 years ago where I was literally driving around an offshore reef system and you'd mark a ball of bait. You didn't even have to mark the fish, but if you marked a ball of bait that was tight, you'd drop your jig straight down and you'd have your jig ready. You just wouldn't have it in a rod, you'd literally have it in one hand driving around. You mark the bait, you prop the boat, drop that jig down, and you got bit nearly every single time. So it's a very, very direct way of fishing, and it's a good way of dropping, obviously, the lure in this case on the fish's head, and you get that reaction bite pretty well straight away.
Yeah. Excellent. Now, we might have more of a chat about that as we go along. I'm sure some of the screenshots will help us to explain some of what you're talking about there. There's a question come through from Matthew Forbes, which I think is a very good one, and it's particularly relevant, I think, to Western Port Bay. But he's keen to hear how you go about sounding for snapper in water that has heavy amounts of weed floating around.
Yeah, well, I think we've got a couple of screenshots there, Greg.
Should we go to the screenshots, mate, if that helps?
I think we should. So these days we talk a lot about chirp. Right, so there's a jigging shot from, and this is using slow jigs or micro jigs, and that's a whole lot of small snapper there. But you can clearly see those little vertical streak lines. That's the jig working through the water, and you know the jig is working well when you're doing that sort of stuff. The great thing is you can clearly target the fish. Like you can see where I'm working the jig and right through the fish. It's up higher in the water column at the start, where there's not as many fish. But then as those fish are rolling through onto the right-hand side of the screen, I'm working the jig closer to the bottom and keeping it in front of those fish. So you don't always mark your jig, but when you do, your sound is tuned right, and it's awesome to be able to have that scenario. But talking about using your sounder and how you get the best out of it in tidal or dirty water, we talk so much about chirp and all that sort of stuff on our sounders these days, and Simrad, the chirp works so well with them. So what chirp's doing is throwing down multiple pulses, like really, really fast, like a machine gun, in a range of frequencies, so it picks up a lot of detail. In tidal, dirty water with weed and stuff like that, it's actually often picking up too much detail. The great thing about the Simrad, especially the Evo 3s, is you can run dual frequency. So you can run high chirp and 50 kilohertz and stuff like that. And quite often, and especially in Western Port, Greg, I always like to run my 50 kilohertz. And it's amazing how it will differentiate between the weed and the air bubbles and the sediment in the water, and it will show the fish up. And I've had days sounding around going, I know there's fish here and you're not marking them that well, or you get a few scratchy marks on the chirp. Run the 50, run both of them at the same time, because the chirp will also pick up stuff that the 50 will miss, even 200, whatever you want to do. But you go to that 50 and you'll just go, bang, there's a snapper. You run your colour high as well. That's the other one I like to do, mate, in those situations, is really differentiate where those fish are in amongst anything that may be sitting in the water column.
Excellent stuff. That was actually, I've been correct. It was actually Matthew. Matthew Forbes?
Yeah.
It was where are we? Matthew Jones asked that question. So apologies to Matthew Jones. Thanks for the LOL, Matthew Forbes. All right, mate. Got another question here. Let me just scroll through. I might just bring you back on the screen, mate.
Sure.
Because you're a lot better looking than that screenshot.
I haven't had a haircut for nearly 8 or 10 weeks.
So Graham Allen's asking about the ideal depth for chasing snapper, mate. This will be an interesting one.
This is an interesting one. So down here at home, you'll catch them in Western Port in November. There's a couple of mud banks that we fish, and they're 4 meters deep. So it's really interesting, and even there you can still sound the snapper if you drift with the tide, or you just come in really slow, come downwind, don't go upwind, so there's no slapping of the boat or anything. You'll still mark them, and it's quite amazing how many fish will get into this shallow water, and that's in 4 meters. Saying that, you can catch them all the way out to 100, no problem at all. You can catch them out to the edge of the shelf. So I don't think there's any set depth, but I think anywhere you've got a reef system that comes out onto rubble bottom up along the coastline is good. Saying that, Greg, like I've caught a lot of snapper off Sydney casting garfish in the washes over the years. So those fish are up against the rocks. So there is no set depth. There's probably the right time to be in the right place. And I explained this to you how we fish down here, that when it's rough, even if it's rough and you can still fish, or when it's rough and it's just coming off a big blow, there's no better place than to be in 4 to 8 metres of water in Port Phillip Bay, because the fish pushing on the edges and they get in on the bass yabbies and the crabs and that. And this is proven day in, day out during snapper season, when the land-based guys just pound big snapper off the piers. So no water too shallow, no water too deep for reds, that's for sure. I know that's not helpful to the guys, but
doesn't seem to affect the size of the fish either. You can get big fish in shallow water, land based, and you can get big fish out deep off the shelf. So
yes, you can. Yeah.
Just
mate, the interesting one too, like even we talk about snapper and where they sit in the water column in South Australia. Oftentimes they're up on the surface, feeding on the surface on toads and stuff like that, and you can literally catch them on stick baits and flies and things like that. So there's no water too deep, too shallow. There's no part of the water column the fish won't hang in. It's a matter of fishing the right way in your area.
Yeah, it also depends where the bait is. If the bait's up off the bottom, they have no problems whatsoever getting up under the bait, as we already discussed. So
yeah. Probably two of the biggest tips I could give quickly, Greg, would be what I've found with snapper fishing. And I learned this, well in my younger years and up in Sydney and fishing the South Coast and doing that. But while you get up when you're sounder and you mark the hard reef, right, you'll mark snapper on that, but you'll also mark a lot of the rubbish fish as well. And you'll catch snapper on that hard. But if you can find the edge where the reef comes away and it goes from reef to rubble, which is where the reef's died, and so it goes to rubble and then generally out to sand, the big fish love to hang on that rubble. They sort of scout the edge of the reef. So you'll find the bigger fish more off to the edges. And this is the scenario also with mulloway, things like that. You find the edge of the reef and the drop-offs and things, and that's where they'll be. The other one is that's interesting is oftentimes the bigger fish sitting higher in the water column, okay? And that's for whatever reason. They're more of a predator. They can move around better. They can eat bigger bait. They can do all that. And this was proven very, very clearly last year in Evans Head with a good mate of mine, Sam Owen, Slug, and he's an absolute gun fisherman. And I'm no gun fisherman, but I'm lucky that I know a lot of guys who are, so I get to learn a lot. And Sam, fishing with him, you always have a ball, but what you learn with these guys is nothing short of amazing. And we were fishing for snapper in anything from sort of 30 to 40 metres of water with plastics. And it was interesting that the earlier in your cast when the plastic was sinking down, so the higher the lure was in the water column, the bigger the fish were. The more time that plastic was in the water and the closer it got to the bottom, the smaller the fish were. So it just proved that point, and he's just said that is pretty standard up there. And we had it where you'd almost cast the plastic out, put in the rod holder, and you get eaten straight away. Like the fish are
yeah, and I can echo that. I've seen similar situations up off the Sunshine Coast, off Barwon Banks and places like that in 100 metres of water. The snapper sitting in 10 metres of water, the lure hits the water, you're letting it sink. You haven't even flipped the bail arm. Suddenly the line's pouring off. You flip the bail arm and you're just tied into a big fish. Yeah.
That's so good. That's why they're such a good fish, I think, Greg. There's so many aspects to snapper fishing.
So many different aspects. Yep. Mate, I'm going to go back to some of our questions. We've got a few of them starting to stack up here, and some about the sonar as well. So we'll get onto those. So Daniel's asking about whether the sonar works well, just straight out of the box, left on auto, mate, or do you have to play around with the settings?
No, it certainly will, and that's the great thing about your Simrad gear. That is the wonderful thing about it. I say it every time. If you can use an iPhone, you can use a Simrad. They work so well in auto, but the great thing is you can override the auto. You don't have to go into a manual setting to then change stuff. You can be in auto and you can adjust your gain up and down and your colour up and down, and that's what makes them so good. So, yes, you can, but I always play around with my sounder, always play around. And I think a big one that a lot of guys don't think of, Greg, is that they will say they will set their sounder in the morning, or they're fishing in 12 metres of water, right, in the morning, and then they end up out in 20 and they don't change the settings, but during the time they've gone to deeper water, the water temperature has probably changed because the sun's come up and it started to heat up, or you've had a tide change. You've got all these variable factors, so always keep just playing around with the unit, just give it a little bit more of this, a little bit more of that. And the great thing is that you can't break them. Okay, so you can't break them. So play around with it. If you think, if you mark something, go back over it and change the settings. But the other one, and I mentioned it in the podcast, Greg, is that if you're making changes, give the sounder a few seconds just to comprehend. It's like me. It's a little bit, it takes a bit for it to sink in. So, just give it a couple of seconds. That's all it requires, but don't just adjust the gain and then go, no, that's no good. Adjust the gain, no, it's so good. And especially more so your colour and stuff, like just give it a few seconds to process and then you'll get the best picture.
I think you suggested in the podcast maybe 30 seconds.
Yeah, especially in deeper water.
Catch up.
Especially in deeper water. Yeah, give it 30 seconds or so. So, yes, Mia, you can eat that. My kids are making the most of this opportunity, Greg, by grabbing lollies, knowing that I'm not going to stop them and cause an argument. So yeah, they're milking it for all it's worth. So in that deeper water especially, mate, just give it a few seconds to let it, just get that right picture, that's for sure. And you will get so much more. If you want to go into your manual settings, then you'll get even more out of your sounder. But just to start with, play around with those auto settings.
Excellent. Now, a question from Matt Hanson about whether you use scent on your deep slow jigs for snapper, and do you like the glow models?
I do like a bit of glow on stuff for snapper, and even down here in Western Port on our bottom baits and stuff like that, I do like to run a glow bead or something like that. The other one I've been doing a lot of lately, Greg, is getting the Black Magic Snapper Snack, which is like the Snapper Snatcher, so it's a flashy attractor, but the Snapper Snack's basically got the skirt like those Lacanis style jigs.
Oh, yeah.
And they come on a paternoster rig, and I chop them up, and I put that skirt on my leader, and then that skirt then sits down just over the hook and the head of my bait. And they've got glow and stuff in them. So definitely a bit of glow. And there's no doubt scent works. I mean, look what gold and stuff like that does. So there's absolutely no doubt that scent works. And I do like to put a smear of scent on my jigs, that's for sure. Because the fish, I think they sometimes just come up and look at it. And by the tentative bite you often get on a slow jig, there's no doubt a bit of scent. And especially because you can rub it into those tinsely sort of hooks that you get on them, and it stays on there quite well.
Lee, just to go back a step, I'm going to indulge my personal curiosity here, but going back to the glow, I have the same experience with snapper. But what I found is I played around with soft plastics that were the whole lure was luminous, and I found that I didn't get very good results with those. But just little splashes of lumo colour on the lure work really well. Has that been your experience? I had a similar conversation with Dick Passfield about barramundi a while back. He said the same thing.
Really,
you had these lumo lures. Barra wouldn't touch them. He coloured most of them in black, so he just had some lumo patches and stripes and bars and that sort of thing, and they love them. So, is that the same with snapper?
I think so, mate. Definitely. I think it's as simple as a glow bead above your hook, like just that little tiny bit of something to arouse their attention. It's the same with UV, massive on UV, and I spoke about that in the podcast. UV, snapper, see it, flat stick, and a good UV lure will just have little splashes of UV, like the throat of the lure or a stripe or something like that. It's not the whole lure necessarily, and it really does make a difference.
Excellent. All right. What do we got here? Another question. So Matt Bowman is asking, do you run side scan and down scan in Western Port when you push up the channels? Yeah,
I certainly do. It's just a game changer, and it's a game changer for several reasons. So, finding fish is one part of it, but I love it for finding the structure. And in Western Port, you're talking about kunji beds and stuff like that. And as you're running up the channels, it's mud bottom, and there can be patches of kunji or rough bottom that are the size of your lounge room. So not overly big patches. So as you can imagine, if you're going over that in 15 or 18 metres of water, you only have to miss it by a couple of metres by your transducer, and you just get nothing. You're on mud. So that side scan is absolutely amazing, just to go, oh, there's some rough ground 20 metres out to the side, or there's a school of snapper, or anything like that. And those snapper, they also, in a lot of areas, in a lot of parts of the country, you'll have channels, steep walls, and it won't matter if it's snapper or barramundi or kingfish or, whatever, mangrove jacks. You run along and you can shoot your sonar out to the side there and be able to see the fish sitting along the edge of the channel and stuff like that. And it's such a good way to fish, that's for sure. And especially when you've got fish moving up and down your tide too, Greg, that are travelling with the water, that's a big help.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I got a great question coming here from Mark Stewart, and it's about how you tell whether fish are active and aggressive and feeding, or whether they're shut down and don't bother throwing a lure at them, mate.
Yeah, okay, that's a really good one, and you can learn a lot, and it's just time on the water that will teach you this sort of stuff. So, obviously, the key one you want to look for, and the one that we all get excited by, is if you've got bait, and if that bait's stacked nice and tight, and you mark a fish sitting up on it, then that's a fish that's feeding. The other one I find though is when you get that very, very perfect boomerang, then it's quite steep. That's generally a fish that's not moving fast. Okay, the more stretched out it is, so the more elongated that the boomerang is, then probably the more that fish is moving around. Saying that, when a snapper's up in the water column and there's bait nearby, there's a fair chance he's feeding. In Port Phillip Bay, when they're on the bottom, it's very much like cows grazing on a paddock. They're just cruising around, just doing their thing. So we often look for the traditional bait fishing method. You're looking for fish sitting hard on the bottom because they're looking for scallops and mussels and crabs and all that sort of stuff. So, but yeah, certainly if you can mark that sort of more flattened out arch, then there's probably more chance your fish are moving around. But for me, Greg, I just love marking them sitting on bait.
Well, I love the analogy you used in the podcast today as well, Lee, and you mentioned again just now that snapper are like cows in a paddock. If they're all packed together and tight down on the bottom, they're probably not feeding or not feeding aggressively. If they're scattered around and you're motoring around, you're seeing one here and one there, but there's a reasonable number, but they're spaced out, then probably they're grazing, they're looking for things to eat, and they're each marking their own little bit of territory.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, it does, and it definitely works here. Look, you will catch them off the big markup, a whole pile of snappers sitting together, but oftentimes you go, oh, get ready, there's snapper everywhere here. And I'm talking they sit stacked on top of each other like a school of kingfish. Oftentimes you won't get a bite. Plenty of times here, Greg, you'll mark one or two fish, you anchor the boat up in Port Phillip Bay, you cast out 6 rods and 6 rods take off.
Yep.
So there's just fish in the area and they're feeding. So it's a very, very... it sounds silly, but it's very much like that, mate. When you mark them all bunched together, they're like cows or sheep in a paddock that aren't happy. So it's great when you mark one here and 50 metres later one there and 100 metres one there, because there's a bunch of fish there when that happens.
But it's also a really good indication. Sonar has changed the game so much, but it's a good indication of why it's important to understand what you're looking at as well and understand the species you're targeting, because if you were to go out there and see a pile of fish stacked up, you'd say, okay, well, this is where I'm going to fish. There's heaps of fish here. Throw your baits out. You could sit there all day with fish all around you, not catch anything. But by understanding the fish's behaviour and understanding what you're looking for, you recognise, okay, there might be fish there, but it's not the best place to fish.
And certainly, look, we're lucky. Well, we're sort of lucky, sort of unlucky here. We don't have a lot of species. So in Port Phillip Bay, pretty well, you either catch a snapper or a flathead. That's about where it's at. But up the coast, for instance, there's other species. And time on the water will even start to teach you what you're looking at. Most people can who do a lot of it. You look at your sounder when you're marlin fishing, you can tell the difference between slimy mackerel and cowie young. You can tell the difference between, snapper and rubbish fish. Time on the water will teach you that sort of stuff, and that's the great thing about your Simrad unit. And the other one is being able to screenshot, Greg. Like, I refer back to my screenshots a lot, which is what we're looking at tonight. Screenshotting, downloading those onto your computer, you have a look at them, you'll get a very, very good understanding of what you're looking at just by looking at those screenshots a lot.
The other great tip, of course, Lee, is when you are out fishing, if you're in one of those locations where you've got lots of potential species around and you pull a snapper up, then have a look back on the sounder, because snapper are school fish. You're likely to see arches on the sounder and you'll recognise that, okay, that's what a snapper looks like on my sounder, the way I've got it set up. And that's a good way to be able to pick what species you're targeting. Yeah, very much so, mate, that's for sure. So, look, time on the water is probably just your main thing. And the great thing is there's so much information these days, like this stuff that we're doing now, the stuff that you can just get online. So there's so much great info that you can get for doing this sort of stuff. Yeah. So it's a good time it's a good period to be in, mate. Like, back people used to use paper sounders to try and work out what they were doing. I remember them. Yeah. I don't want to admit to it, but I do remember them, yeah. So let's move on. So Stuart Rainbow's asking about moon phase and snapper bite. You might be opening a can of worms here, Stuart. Lots of opinions on this one, but let's have yours, Lee.
Like most fishing, I like build up to the full moon. but not too close to the full moon. I do like the back end of the moon because you tend to get bigger tides, so you get a bit better water flow in our part of the world. So, but the other one I think that a lot of anglers don't put enough emphasis on, and I'm guilty of it, except for probably the last 10 years, is moonrise and moonset. Okay, so quite often guys will go, we banged the snapper at 11:30. They went at 11 a.m. till 12, and they just banged them, and it was the middle of the tide. Quite often that could have been a moonrise or a moonset. That's a critical sort of thing. Like we hooked a massive swordfish early this season, and we hooked him right on the moonset at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It was right on the prime time to get a bite. So, and it was nothing to do with the tide change. So if guys start to look at moonrise, moonset, then that's a really good period.
Excellent. All right, another question coming up. I'm going to have to read this one to you because only part of it will come up on the screen. But we've got Simon asking, he's just starting out snapper fishing outside the lakes, and he's looking to use his Evo 3 to build some marks that he can fish for himself. So what advice would you have for a newbie who's just getting started to build up those marks?
Again, time on the water, just try and find those key standard marks, like off Lakes Entrance, you've got the pipes, you've got the grains, you've got the meton rocks, and they're all different sort of areas. But again, just start to use your sounder, put the time in, ask the locals for some advice. I fish out, it's my favourite place to snapper fish is out of Lakes Entrance. There's a lot of big snapper out of there. And the local boys are all really, really friendly. They're really friendly blokes, and they will help you out, with getting the right info. So, and again, that's a part of the world you start to learn what you're looking at. You will know when you're marking snapper or when you're marking other fish. And in that part of the world, you're a very, very good chance of 10 kilo fish, that's for sure. So it's just, I would suggest just get some local knowledge. That's the biggest thing. Just to get that foot, get that foot on the ground, get yourself running, and you'll be right.
The thing that I would suggest also, Simon, is that a mark is just a guide. If you've got a mark in your GPS, it doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be fish there next time just because it was fish there last time. So use it as a guide. Obviously, build up marks, but every day you go out there, you need to use your sonar and have a look around and see what's happening. Find the bait, find the fish, and all that kind of stuff. So don't just assume that when you get back to your mark that you're at last week, it's necessarily
actually perfect example of that. Very quickly, Greg, is in about April every year off lakes, the snapper coming off the back of the beaches or further down to the west. And I'm talking you're fishing in 15 to 18 metres of water on pure sand. And those fish are there eating crabs and prawns. That's all they're doing. So a mark means absolutely nothing in that part of the world. But then when you get to your meton rocks, it's more like a Port Phillip Bay scenario where it's muddy bottom with probably just there's rocks on the bottom, just here, there, scattered, whatever. So there's no real structure. And yet where the fish are today, they can be half a kilometre away tomorrow. So it is a case of sounding around, keeping an eye on your sounder, and finding the fish that way.
But obviously, it does give you a bit of confidence if you've got a starting point. So
I love a starting point. Yeah, and there's no doubt, Greg, it doesn't matter where in the country that I travel, if we're filming or if I'm just going fishing, if it's a new spot, I'm after a mark. And I say to guys, it doesn't have to be X marks the spot, but I just need a couple of starting points to then work off. And
to figure it out from. Yeah,
that's exactly what you need. Yep.
All right, great question from Doug Reed. Have you tried medium chip TM 185 transducer?
Medium chip TM 185? No, I haven't. I've got the because I've got the 175 low and 175 high wide, but I know that TM 185s are very, very popular. There's a lot of them going around. So, there's a lot of them on because a lot of them on transom mount transducer setup. So very popular unit that does work very, very well. However, if you're going to go into your specific deep water stuff, like your swords and your deep dropping and all that sort of stuff, you do need to look at the 175 low, that's for sure.
All right. One from Lachlan asking about what we're looking for in the Navionics maps with regards to depth and contours, mate.
I suppose in that sort of stuff, if you're talking an offshore situation, I suppose you're looking for reef systems. And while I'm looking for the reef system, I also then want to get out there and plug out that reef system and work out where the edge of the reef system is. You want to work out, and it doesn't matter if it's snapper or whatever, you want to work out where that tide's going to be pushing into that reef system. So you're going to work out what side the fish potentially be fishing, like sitting on. Obviously, if you've got a bit of tide or current, you want to be fishing, and you generally want to be fishing the upside of that reef system, so that your burley or your bait or your lures, as you are going back towards that area. So I look for that, and that's a great thing. Those mapping systems these days just fast track everything, that's for sure. And especially with that insight genesis stuff that's going on now too. There's a lot of areas that have just uncovered patches of reef and piles of structure that you didn't even know that were there. So it's a really good thing.
Yep. We've got a pile of questions here, guys, and we're going to keep going through them. We will answer all your questions before we finish the evening, and we've also got some screenshots that we haven't even started on yet. But I think it's probably better to go through the questions, Lee, as they come up, because
Sure.
This is obviously what people want to know. And if there's an opportunity to switch over to the screenshots to answer one of the questions, we'll do that. So do we need different sonar frequencies in Port Phillip Bay versus Western Port?
I think we do. Yeah, I think we do. And I think generally in Western Port, I do like to run dual frequency. I like to run my colour higher in Western Port oftentimes to just differentiate stuff that's going on. So Port Phillip, early morning and at night, at times when you get the sea lice, that's when it can be worth running dual frequency, because the sea lice will kill you, and the chirp just picks up every single sea lice in the ocean. Like, it's that good. So it's really hard to see through. But overall, look, if you just want to run high chirp, you will still mark fish and what's going on, no problem at all. But if you've got the capability to run dual, so run high chirp and at 50 kilohertz or 200 kilohertz, then it's worth playing around with it. That's for sure.
Excellent. You got a fan there in Misha, Lee, who's been watching you for a long time. Loves what you do. Good on you, Misha. Can you give us your thoughts, mate, on transducer banging away, putting the snapper off the bite? This is a really. I'm glad you asked this question, Brad. This is a really common question about whether the transducer scares the fish away.
Look, for a lot of years, we would always, especially in Port Phillip Bay, stop fishing, turn the sounder off for that reason. Nowadays, we tend to leave it running, and you still catch plenty of fish with the rig straight under the boat. So I don't know. It's almost like, I wonder if, and I always work on this theory too, Greg, if I'm fishing at night, I hate fishing in the dark. Like, I'm not a person who can sit there in the dark in my boat and not be able to see anything. But I work on the theory that if you've got the lights on when you start fishing and you leave the lights on, it's fine. The worst thing you can do is have the lights off, then flick the lights on, and then turn the lights off and flick them on. Like, it's like us, if we're in the dark and someone turns lights on, we freak out. So same thing, if you turn your transducer on and off, whatever, that's probably going to have a bigger effect than if it's just sitting there pinging away, constantly. So it's really up to you. And look, some guys I know turn their sounder off, and if they're not catching fish, they'll turn it on. And they reckon sometimes it makes them get a bite because maybe fish were sitting under the boat, and it makes them scatter and move and find some baits that they potentially weren't seeing.
Well, certainly if you get up on the Bass Lakes, it's not an uncommon ploy to put your boat over the top of fish and with the sounder on and slowly motor out into deeper water, and the school of fish will actually follow you and come onto the tube as they come into deeper water. So it's a tournament tactic that we've been told of a couple of times on the lure fishing podcast.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But I mean, from a scientific perspective, what fish can hear and what they can't hear is quite an interesting thing. And there's a lot of frequencies, and I liken it to the old dog whistle. We can blow a dog whistle as hard as we like.
Yep.
The harder we blow it, the louder it is, but we still can't hear it. The old dog's got his paws over his head and his ears are bleeding, but we can't hear it. And there's a lot of sounds that are within our hearing range that aren't within the hearing range of fish.
Yes.
And there's a lot of sounds conversely at the lower end of those frequency ranges that are audible to fish that we can't hear. So, and a lot of those they feel through their lateral line. So once you get down to around that 100 hertz sort of range. So where it sits on the scale with sonar, I don't know. But
look, I'm sure it has some effect on them. There's no doubt. You see it when you're marlin fishing. A lot of boats with all the sounders pinging away on the bait. It definitely pushes the bait down. Yeah. So I mean, you put your hand under your transducer when it's on the trailer, and you can feel it pinging away. So I have no doubt the fish feel it. But
there's got to be something there. And to pull another example as well, quite often I used to fish for snapper in really shallow water in Moreton Bay, 3, 4, 5 meters, where you drop a ball sinker on the bottom of the boat and the fish are gone, just the slightest sound. You go over to Western Australia, Alan Bevan over there is pulling up 15 kilo monsters in 5 meters of water. And what he does is he pulls up on the reef and he bangs the side of the boat, because the snapper have become accustomed to the crayfish when pulling up their pots and throwing the bait over the side, so they come up to the sound. So I think it depends on the fish and what they're accustomed to as well.
Yeah, exactly.
probably no easy answer to that one. So
No, there's not. Look,
sorry if you haven't answered your question, Brad. We probably
sorry, Brad. We went round in circles on that one. So.
But yeah, look, personally, I think experiment, mate, and see what happens.
Yeah,
but,
the biggest thing to watch, and this is a hot tip for people. So these days, if you're running your Simrad units and your big and any sounder, but if you're running them with big transducers and all the gear, they suck a lot of power. Okay, don't sit there on anchor for 4 hours with your sounder running. Okay, because you will flatten your batteries. Or make sure you switch over to one battery. On the dash of my boat, I've got a couple of Nava battery gauge switches, and as long as the batteries are on, I can see where my battery volts are at. And it's a really handy thing because while you're fishing, you just constantly turn around, look at the dash, obviously look at the sounder, and you monitor these battery volts. And it's plenty of people's motors haven't started because they've left their sounders running for too long.
Battery to get home, guys.
Yeah, exactly. So be aware of that, and a lot of guys fall for it when they get these. They might jump out of a smaller unit, and they finally bit the bullet and gone and bought themselves like a 12-inch Simrad and a big transducer and done all that, and they don't realise the power that those things suck when they're running. So keep that in mind.
Absolutely. Question about barometric pressure and whether it makes a difference to fish being on the bite or not. So, Michael, that was actually something we talked about in the podcast, so I might refer you back there. But Lee, let's give him the deal here and now.
Definitely, it definitely has an effect. There is no doubt that it has an effect, and a high barometer gets the fish to feed well. Low barometer generally shuts them down. Saying that, the only time this is different, it seems, is for guys land-based fishing, where the fish are in super shallow water, and those fish that are there, they're there for one reason, they're there to eat. So, but generally speaking, out in normal depths of water from 10 or 12 to 50 metres of water, barometer has a huge effect, and they reckon that what it is, the low air pressure makes their swim bladders increase, so they float higher in the water column, and they definitely sit high, like just sitting higher in the water column. They might be 2, 3, 4, 5 metres off the bottom, and because their swim bladder's increased, it's keeping their stomach small. There's not the room, and they don't feel full, and so they don't eat and stuff like that. But then similarly, or at the opposite end, when the barometer starts to rise, their swim bladder decreases, and then they go, geez, I haven't eaten for a couple of days, and that's why you tend to get a good bite. They say that you tend to get a good bite when the barometer rises. The other one that we do find here, though, Greg, is I love a nice steady climbing barometer. Okay. And especially when it gets up around that 1,015, 1,020, that's just when the fish just chew. But saying that, I've also had a waft where the barometer is low, like say it's 1,005, right? 1,008, and then it skyrockets to 120, 1,025. Like I'm talking in a matter of hours, it's up at 1,025, 1,028. That's not good for fishing either. I've had plenty of times when we're all sitting there going, fish going to bite their heads off, barometer's going to go off. And the barometer goes 1,028 in 6 to 12 hours, and the fishing just doesn't happen. And maybe it's just too much pressure change. Who knows?
I think maybe their swim bladder gets compressed, so they sink to the bottom like stones, mate. They'll just
maybe, but that's just one more of my excuses as to why the fish didn't bite that day.
Excellent. All right, so Matt Hanson's asking, mate, what's your favourite retrieve style, mate? I reckon we might need a little bit more information on that one. So if you'd like to let us.
Talking plastics, I suppose. I'll just say plastics. I like to cast it out, let it sink down, but give it a couple of short flicks every now and then, not overwork it. On jigs, I like to work jigs slow for snapper. Like I'm talking like slow, like just lift and fall, just especially that slow pitch jigging where you just do half a turn and one turn. And what's interesting is most of the bigger snapper I've caught on jigs, the bite's really tentative. It's like a flathead nibbling away at it or some pickerfish nibbling away. It's not very often that they slam the jig. They just tend to like tap it and then load up on it. So, which is interesting because then when they eat a live slimy mackerel or something, they smash it, like they destroy it. So, but look, I know a lot of guys who catch a far more snapper than I do on lures every year, and especially up the coast. So basically, you cast the plastic out if you're fishing plastics, and you put the rod in the holder and you let it sink down. And the trick's to have it sinking slowly, so a lighter jig head. That seems to be more of the key, is a slow fall rather than a retrieve style.
Okay. And Matthew's actually posted another question a bit later on, so I think you've actually hit the nail right on the head there, Lee. Cool. So let us know, Matt, if you've covered that.
The other one too, though, Matt, is if there's two of you fishing and you're both jigging, have one guy fishing a slow pitch jig, fishing really slow, and have the other guy fishing, more of just your smaller flutter jigs, but fishing that one faster, because they vary day to day as well. There's no point both people fishing the same methods. Don't fish the same colours. Like, we always mix it up. Like, I love my pinks and my oranges for snapper, but if there's two of us jigging, one will fish a bright colour and one will fish a really natural colour. And they both have their days.
Excellent. All right, let's have a look at another question. So, Lee, can you please provide some information on which frequency, a high chirp 200 kilohertz, low chirp 50 kilohertz, medium chirp, with respect to depth and speed of travel?
Okay, so there's so many factors, I think, more so to that. Like, it's your boat setup, it's obviously water depth, it's stuff like that. So, high chirp is your setup for shallower water. Saying that, if I go high chirp and 50 kilohertz, and this is the thing, you can play around with all this sort of stuff. The 50 kilohertz is a very narrow beam, but it gives you a very, very good picture. So if you've got a Western Port situation, or say down that part of Moreton Bay where you've got your tide and all that sort of stuff, then that's where that 50 will really come into its own. In Port Phillip Bay, your 200, where you have no tide, you get a wider beam, it picks up the detail. So you're going to find different scenarios where it's all going to be relevant. But generally speaking, your low chirp 50 is better for deeper water, your high chirp 200 for your shallower, and then your medium is your medium.
Yeah, excellent. All right, so we've question from who we got here? Ishfaq.
Yeah.
What do you think of lure color? I think we've already touched on that, but you might want to elaborate, Lee.
Yeah, look, I like my pinks and my oranges and stuff like that, but it's going to vary whereabouts in the country you fish, I think. I know a lot of guys love white up the coast, up in New South Wales and stuff. White's a great colour. And I think snapper are a bit of a visual fish as well. Like, it definitely seems that way. There's something that, if it stands out, they're probably a little bit inquisitive on that. So my go-to, Greg, if it's a lure, it generally has a bit of pink in it for snapper. They seem to like a little bit of pink in it.
There you go. And mine's white.
Is it?
Yes. So there you go.
Yeah.
So question from Stephanie, mate, about whether you do tutorials on boat.
Yep. I'm starting to get into doing that sort of stuff. So, yeah, that's the next phase and next year. Yeah, definitely. Because this is people have the gear, they want to know how to use it and get those little 1%ers that make it all work better.
Yep. Get in touch with Lee via social media.
Yeah, that's no problem.
Want to find out more about that? Yep.
Yep.
So we've got Adrian Bibby. So let me just scroll down here so I can actually read it. If we can get out into Port Phillip Bay this year, I'd like to try some of my homemade hard bodies. Well done, mate. Good to hear.
Yeah, that's cool.
What size and action would you recommend? You said they feed higher up. Would shallow divers work at 1 to 2 metres?
Look, they would if the fish are up there, but generally speaking, anything in Port Phillip Bay, generally anything mid-water to the bottom is where you tend to find the fish. You will find them up higher, and you will catch them up higher, and I've caught them trolling for salmon. But look, I love, if I'm fishing around Port Phillip Bay, fishing in 6 or 8 metres of water, I love a little diver that dives, 9 to 12 feet. The little X-Rap 10 is a perfect lure for that. So I've caught lots and lots of snapper on X-Rap 10, even out in 10 metres of water. So the other one too, Greg, a lot of guys here troll cod lures, like on the kayaks. A lot of them pull cod lures. So, and I've trolled them around a little bit, but I do personally just love my real nice bait fishy looking stuff like your X-Raps or your Lucky Crafts and stuff like that. So some of the smaller pacemakers from Samaki that Josh makes, they've caught a lot of snapper as well. So mix it up. That's the main tip I can give.
Yeah. So Peter is asking, is there a way to get rid of sea lice on the sound? I know there is, mate, because we've talked about this already in the podcast. So in Port Phillip Bay, heaps of arches in the dark and the sound, but nothing once the sun's up.
Yeah, that's it. So the sea lice come out of the mud in the dark on the moon and eat your baits and do all that. And definitely that is where you need to go to a set frequency. You can run your high chirp, but also run 50 or 200, but generally 50 in that scenario. It basically cuts the crap. It gets rid of the sea lice, and you will mark, because the snapper is still there. There's no problem at all. The snapper is still there. You just need to be able to find them. So you go to your 50, and you may have to do a little bit more sounding because you're not throwing wider beam, so you can easily miss the fish. But when you mark them, you'll mark them. You will have absolutely no doubt in your mind when you mark them. That's for sure. And if not, run your chirp right? Run your sensitivity down, because otherwise you're going to pick up every bit of rubbish, right? Run your colour really high, okay? And then if you get some sort of like little weak return, then you can quickly just bump the gain up, and you'll go, oh, there's a fish there. So that's the other option that you can do as well.
Yeah, good stuff. Answer this one very quickly, and then what I'd like to do, Lee, is zap over and have a look at some screenshots, because we're nearly an hour into this masterclass.
Michael's asking where can you see the podcast, Greg?
Yeah.
Or hear the
so
podcast.
Michael's asking where can you see the podcast. So, Michael, if you zap over to doclures.com, doclures.com, it's episode 275, so it'll be the top one on the list there. And Lee and I have a pretty good chat there about targeting snapper in Western Port and Port Phillip Bay, so lots of great information there. So, Lee, let's pull up one of your screenshots, because we need to give you a little bit of a breather for a second.
No, you're right.
And have a bit of a chat about some
I'm good at talking.
Yeah. so am I, mate, surprisingly. Yeah. So, is this just a brag shot, mate, or what are we
No, this is my mate Tim. This is out of Port Welsh Pool or Corner Inlet, and a couple of things going on here. That is a classic Gippsland looking snapper. Like, it's got the nose, it's got the big tail, the big mouth, the whole lot, and the fish does as well. So no, that's like a classic fish. That was about 9 kilos, that one. But you'll see too that thing hanging out of its mouth, Greg. That's one of those like rubber skirts that I was talking about, the snapper snack. So yeah, so that's just, that's what everyone wants to catch. I remember as a kid, that's all I wanted to catch was a big snapper and a big mulloway. They're just a fish. They look so good when they come up next to the boat. I don't think anyone gets sick of seeing a big snapper pop up, that's for sure.
You never get bored of seeing that colour when they come up alongside the boat, do you?
No, you don't. Right. And especially those ocean fish with those blue through their fins and stuff. They're just the best. Yeah,
absolutely. All right, let's have a look at some screenshots here.
Okay. So this is actually off a Lowrance unit. So just sort of throw this one in to mix it up a little bit. But you quickly hear that you see that there's bait. You'll see that there's bait. Sorry, kids are fighting. So you see that there's a lot of bait here, but then off to the right-hand side of the screen, you're actually starting, and there's a few fish to the left, but you're clearly starting to mark fish sitting hard in the bait here on the right-hand side of the screen. I think I'd also adjust the sensitivity by that point as well. We're running 50 kilohertz. Scroll speed is normal, and I like to run just a normal scroll speed. The faster your scroll speed, the more flatter the arch is going to be. The more flatter the arch is going to be, and also my ping speed is quite high, so that's the amount of pulses that are going down. So it's a pretty clear picture. There's a lot going on there. There's a lot of bait, but there's also a few fish there, especially that right-hand side of the screen. And you can see they're sitting up on that bait as well too. They're not actually on the bottom. They're sitting up on that bait, pushing it around a bit.
And you can also see the structure or the lack of structure, obviously.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, Port Phillip Bay at its finest.
Here you've got, bait over a flat bottom.
Over a mud bottom, yeah. And a lot of the bait in the bay is just pilchards and white bait and tiny little bottle squid and stuff like that. So, and this is the thing with Port Phillip Bay. The fish move around, like cattle in a paddock. So you need to be prepared to move with them.
Yep, absolutely. All right.
Well, I like this one. So this one here, so we're running 200 kilohertz, fairly cold water. And this is showing you a lot of detail. So obviously we've got is big bait and small bait. You've got the small bait that's just marking up as little dots and specks, but then there's also bigger bait that's actually showing sort of as arches and stuff as well. So in this case, the small bait would have probably been white bait, the bigger bait, the little yappers or slimies and stuff like that. The water's not overly warm at 16.6 degrees, which is, that's sort of the trigger point in Port Phillip Bay, it seems, and even Western Port, you get that 16-degree water and the fish start to feed. So, but what's interesting, Greg, is right there in that middle of the screen there, you can clearly see 2 big fish sitting up on the bait, that's for sure. So, and those are the fish that, as a lure fisherman, you get excited about.
I was going to say, only one reason for those fish to be there.
Exactly. They're feeding. They're, that little ball of bait that's on its own, that's what I like too, rather than the massive pile of bait. I love that little broken off piece on its own, because it's much easier for 1 or 2 fish to try and hold 100 bait fish than it is to try and hold 10,000. So that's what they've done there. They've cracked them off. They've got them on their own. If you're lure fishing, perfect. If you're jigging, drop that jig straight down on them and you'll often get the bite. If you're bait fishing, because those fish are sitting up basically about 3 metres off the bottom, it's time to take the sinkers off and get those baits floating down and keep working those baits. Don't just let them sit on the bottom for 15, 20 minutes. When they hit the bottom, give them a minute or two, wind them up, and then sink them back down again. Because those fish are not on the bottom, so don't fish your baits on the bottom.
I'm just going to bring up a question, speaking of bait, Lee, that came up a little while ago. So what's a more effective bait, freshly caught or frozen? Does it vary with conditions?
Oh, look, I think it's very hard to go past fresh bait anywhere in the world, isn't it? But, fresh squid or whatever. But saying that, frozen pillies account for probably more snapper in port fillet bay than anything. I think that the quality of your bait is so important, Greg, to make sure your bait is good. I have no problem at all pulling squid out of my freezer. I've caught heaps of mulloway on frozen squid and big snapper and that, but it's well looked after. A couple of tips. Buy your bait fresh, okay? And a lot of the bait you get from your bait shops is very, very good because it's actually packed straight away. Everyone goes, I'm going to the market and buy my bait from the market. That bait could have come in 4 days ago and it's just been sitting on ice. So unless you're getting the bait...
It could have come in from Vietnam and been treated with chemicals too.
Well, that's true, yeah. But like if you're getting your bait from the market, you want to be there on the day that the bait arrives, then it's fresh. Okay, if you're there a couple of days later, it's not that fresh. So, look, pillies are obviously a wonderful bait for snapper and probably every fish in the ocean. If you're getting your own bait, a couple of tips: don't ever let your bait touch fresh water. I reckon that's the biggest thing that wrecks people's bait is fresh water. So, look, I have no problem at all pulling squid 3 or 4 months, 5 months old out of the freezer and confidently using that to catch fish. Obviously, wherever possible, we use fresh bait. But, that is a big key to catching it. Certainly your bigger fish, I think, they love the fresh stuff, that's for sure.
Yep. So a question here from Mark about what snapper looked like on the side scan. Have we got any side scan?
I haven't got any side scan shots, no. I don't have any side scan shots. It's sort of like a stretched out blob, if that makes sense, like a jelly beany sort of shape, I suppose. But you generally know because you've got a good shadow. You generally know because there's a pretty solid shadow behind them, that's for sure.
Yeah, yep. So, all right. Let's just zap back to our screenshots for a moment.
What have we got here? So this one here is high chirp. And this one here shows, this is in Western Port, and you've got a lot of stuff going on. This is what your chirp does. So see, you've got lots and lots of marks and scratches and looks like lots of tiny little fish zipping around everywhere, but you've obviously got one very clear snapper in the middle on some rough bottom. You can see that bottom going up and down. So we're running 2x zoom there, so we've got a pretty good picture of what's going on. And the colour's fairly high on this. This is an older screenshot, but the colour's fairly high. So we've got rough bottom just with one nice big fish in that scenario there. That's your classic shot there, I think, Greg. There you go. That's Port Phillip Bay, and you've got 2 big snapper sitting on the mud, just doing that, just sitting there on the mud doing their thing. And that, if I was fishing, and I obviously was fishing, that gets me excited. Just seeing 2 fish sitting like that. That's what I stop on. Absolutely love that. Sitting hard on the bottom, probably doing their thing, nose down, feeding, doing whatever they're doing.
So that's the classic example of what we were talking about earlier on with the snapper being like cattle, that they're you've got a couple of lone fish there, they're out feeding.
Yes.
So it's a good time to be fishing. So question from Andrew about, do you use Sonar Chart Live or Genesis mapping for finding new ground? What would you recommend?
I do like Genesis mapping if people have done it, but that Sonar Live stuff's very good too. So they've both got their place, but that Genesis mapping, because it's, guys have been over it and done it, and it's seen it right there. And so I think Genesis mapping's good, that's for sure. I think they're both good. Now,
I know you're going to love this question, mate. It's all about trolling with hard bodies using a downrigger. It's something we talked about again earlier on today. So what's the ideal distance to run the lure behind the downrigger ball? Okay, so I'll go through. I do like a lure that dives below my bomb, because snapper do not like downrigger bombs at all. They're not a kingfish or a snapper trout or whatever. So I like a lure that dives below the bomb. I like a lure that I know what depth it runs. So I tend to run, say, a Rapala Rat Trap 10. Because I know it dives 10 foot below my bomb, and I put it about 10 metres behind the bomb. So let the lure out about 10 metres with your multicoloured braid, let it out one colour, put the line in the clip, and then send it down. And then you know that fluid is diving 10 foot
behind 10 foot below the bomb. You're in 60 foot of water, you run the bomb down 45 foot, the lure's going to run at 55 foot, your lure's 5 foot off the bottom. It's a nice, simple sort of formula.
Yeah, and as you were saying earlier on as well, keep it a little bit off the bottom, otherwise you're going to pick up all the flathead.
Yeah, you do. You get way too many flathead.
Want to target snapper, just keep it a little bit higher up.
And also run the clip pretty hard, which we talked about too, Greg. I like to run the clip hard because I like to use that to sort of help set the hook as well.
Yep. So a lengthy question here from Andrew. He fishes the top end of Western Port and he's found some areas around the mangroves in less than 2 metres.
Yep.
Like the flats on high tide around Blind Bight. So many people fish deep where they're in the shallows. Any thoughts or experiences as they do target them that way in New Zealand?
Yeah, those fish are getting up on the flats. That's what they're doing. And if they're not there, the mulloway there and everything's there. There's no problem. I haven't fished for them in 2 metres of water, but I've caught them in 3 and 4 metres. So I don't see why they wouldn't be in 2 metres. That's for sure. So certainly, water can't be too shallow for snapper, and they prove it time and again in New Zealand. And again, those flats in Western Port are full of food. They're basically big bass yabby beds. They're covered in crabs. There's flounder and mullet and all that sort of stuff there. So certainly, worth fishing the shallow water. And the best thing is if you can have 2 metres of water with a drop off nearby, that's where the fish, they will come up out of those drop offs onto the flats. They need obviously a quick, easy escape route. That's for sure.
Yeah, like most predators, deep water's not too far away, generally speaking.
Exactly.
Good question from Ross as well about what's your preferred boat speed when you're sounding in Port Phillip Bay looking for snapper?
Look, the great thing about the units these days, you can sound faster, and that is one big asset, that's for sure. So, years ago, we basically were going as slow as we could to try and get the best reading we could. Now we sound around at 12, 15 k's an hour, no problem at all. Obviously, it's going to depend on conditions. But I suppose, if you said 10 k's an hour, that's sort of perfect. 8 k's an hour is sort of perfect just to poke around. If it's rough, you're obviously going to go slower. If you want to get the best reading in rough weather, run down sea. That's the best way. Get the boat to run nice and smooth, and you'll get the best reading. So, but it's going to depend on setup too. I know I can sound quite fast in my boat, and other guys can't sound as fast in their boat. And it's all just transducer setup. You can generally sound much faster if you've got a through-hole transducer than a transom mount. So you've got all these factors. You just need to do what's best for you.
Yep, excellent. So a question about fishing the shallows.
Yep.
I want to come up on the screen. Where is it? Here we go. So when you're fishing the shallows for snapper, is it better to drive over an area and sound up the fish, or to throw lures or baits into areas that you haven't been over so as not to scare the fish?
Look, if you're confident enough to get into your area and just anchor up, do it, obviously. I always like to try and, though, if I'm in shallower water, I do like to come in at the best angle. So if I'm in an area that I think I'm going to find the fish, I like to come in, with the sea or with the tide, so that the boat's running smoother and I can have less revs on the engine. I can be just in gear, rather than pushing into the tide or pushing into the wind. So I'm making the least amount of noise possible. When I find something, don't go circling around over it and check it again and again and again. Just go, oh, that's it, mark it on the GPS, get out of there, get upwind or up current, drop the pick or do whatever you've got to do and get yourself in position.
All right, Lee, when you're trolling snapper, are you on the main motor or are you on the electric motor?
No, I'm on the big motor if I need to be. There's a anchor out if I need to be. Obviously, if you've got a smaller boat with an electric, then that's even better. Especially jigging too. If you've got your small boat these days, run the motor guide. And if you can use the anchor function when you mark something, you just anchor and it just sits the boat right there on top of the fish. That's
perfect.
So.
Lee, we've got plenty of questions coming, guys. We're not ignoring them. We will come back to them, but I'm going to jump over to some screenshots again for just a moment.
Yep.
And that'll give Lee a chance while the screens, he's not on the screen, he can wave at his kids and instead of kids and all that sort of stuff. But let's have a look at some screenshots, and we will come back, folks, and answer all of your questions before we finish up. So, Lee, what have we got going on here, mate? Obviously, a couple of good fish here.
So this is a perfect scenario. Say poor fella bait, a little bit of structure, whatever it may be. Probably one of those native fridges, or who knows, whatever people tend to drop in the bay. But you've got a bunch of small snappers sitting on the structure, right? But what's exciting about this one is off there to the right-hand side of the screen, you have that one big fish sitting on his own. And this refers back to, Greg, what we were talking about before, the big fish sitting off the structure. Okay, and a lot of guys will drive over the structure and mark little fish like that, or mark not a lot, and then go, oh no, there's nothing there. What I like to do is basically like a spiral out off the structure and sound around and around and around, getting wider and wider, or do passes over it. But I'll go 100 metres off the structure, and quite often the big fish, will be sitting 50 to 100 metres away from where the big structure is. So don't think that if you don't mark them on the structure that they're not there.
Yeah, cool. All right. What's this all about?
This one here is just, again, you've got a bit of a rise in the bottom. You've got a bit of hard reef there. You've got a bit of scattered bait to the right-hand side, but on the left-hand side there, you've got that column of bait. So this was tiny little slimy mackerel, okay? And you've got two nice snapper pushing that bait. That's what they're doing. So that's, again, perfect scenario if you're a lure fisherman, but also bait fishing. But you've got a good sequence of events here. You've got bait, you've got fish, and you've got structure and it's natural structure. You can see that sort of rise in the bottom in the screen there. So it's a really sort of great scenario to find yourself in.
Everything's good.
And you've got 17-degree water, which is even better.
And I'm guessing that the tide's moving from left to right on this screen.
Suppose so.
Well, I'm just assuming the fish and the bait are up current of the structure.
Yeah, for sure.
Assumption that I've made there.
Yeah, for sure.
All right.
So here we go. So this is Western Port, 21 metres of water. We've obviously got some up and down bottom, right? So on the left hand, we've got 18-degree water, so it's ideal for snapper, right? We've got on the left-hand side of the screen, we've got the high chirp, okay? And you can clearly see there's a lot going on. So the chirp's just picking up a lot of detail, okay? And while it's marking the fish on the bottom there at the middle of the screen, right, it's just a little scratch. We've got 50 kilohertz running on the opposite side, and yes, I've got a 2x zoom, but you can see there's not as much clutter on the screen, and you can see that there's actually 3 snapper there. There's not one, but there's 3. We've got 2 clear marks, but then there's also more to the left-hand side. There's more of a vertical line on its own. That's a snapper.
Yep.
So, I think that just clearly shows the difference between running your high chirp and your low chirp and variable frequencies and stuff like that. And you can clearly see I'm running a fair bit of colour there as well, and that fair bit of colour is what's helping to define those snapper, that's for sure.
So what was causing the noise and the clutter and the high chirp on that particular
Look, I think in Western Port, because you've got this tide and stuff like that, I think you've got there's just a lot of factors, Greg. You've got weed, you've got sediment in the water at times, like it's not generally crystal clear water. There's air bubbles. There's just a lot, just general flowing water. I think that creates, these high chirp transducers are so good that they pick up all that stuff. I think that's just part of it. They're just that good.
Yep. So it's a double-edged sword, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, it is. But how good is it that now you can run dual frequencies? Like, who would have ever thought that you could run high chirp and 50 kilohertz? That's just it's stupid to be able to do that sort of stuff.
Game changing stuff.
Yeah, and it's with the press of a button, and you can set your screen up. You go into your menus on your setup page, and you can actually drag and drop and drag and make your own screens and do all that, and I can do it, so it's easy.
You're talking yourself down, mate. We know you're pretty smart. All right, so Theo's asking, is there anything on the market you can use to wipe clean a transducer screen? So he's got a through-hole SS1751 or 175i.
Yep.
With transom mount total scan tranny.
Yep. I've never wiped clean my transducer with anything other than soapy water. So, but it's worth keeping an eye on them, that's for sure. I wouldn't probably use anything harsh on them. I wouldn't go putting some harsh chemical. Look, I just find warm soapy water, with a good wash and wax is the best thing for cleaning sounders, boats, trailers, the whole lot. So I just like to use that sort of stuff. Again, I wouldn't be putting harsh chemicals onto my transducers, that's for sure.
If there's something particular that's clogging up your transducer, let us know, because there might be some advice we can give. I know that if you're in the mangroves a lot, often there's that oily sort of film that comes from the mangroves that can coat hulls and transducers. But usually, warm soapy water will take that off if it's that big a deal.
Yeah.
But let us know if there's something, and maybe we can refer you to the Simrad guys for some advice if we don't have the answer. So. Let me just scroll through, Lee, see if we've got some more questions here. So a question from Clint about what's the best rig for snapper fishing in Port Phillip Bay?
Probably most people would run a 2-hook rig, generally a snelled rig, so the 2 hooks fixed on a leader of 30 to 50 pound, with a swivel and a ball sinker. What I do like to run though, Greg, is I like to run a little ball sinker between the hooks and the swivel, not above it.
Okay.
Because some weird stuff goes on in the bay, and there's just enough tide that your sinker tends to slide up the line and twist around and do all this weird stuff. So, and also because we run multiple rods and we cast them out around the back of the boat, right, you find that when you cast, if your leader's a little bit long, the ball sinker slides up the line and you just can't cast as well. By having the ball sinker sitting down onto the bait, it's much easier to cast. You can just basically give it a flick and it will go much further.
So what length of leader would you have between the swivel and the hooks with that rig?
3 foot.
Okay.
Not long. Yep. So
enough though that the fish can, if the ball sinker's down on the bait, the fish can pick it up and carry it a small distance without picking up the weight.
Definitely.
Using pretty small sinkers in Port Phillip Bay.
We're using pretty small sinkers, and even at the point some guys go, sinker or no sinker, you go, mate, the pilchard weighs more than the sinker.
Yeah.
So let's not get too fussy. Generally it's a size 1 ball sinker. That's about the most common size that people use. So it's not an overly big piece of lead, but it does help. So I do like to fish baits as well without sinkers as well. So, but generally 2-hook snell rig is the most popular in Port Phillip Bay.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So Michael's made a comment that he believes that water with a bit of chop tends to produce bigger fish, and calmer glassing conditions tend to produce less fish. What's your opinion on that?
Oh, look, without doubt. Look, you have those glamour days when it's glass calm and you catch big fish, but for the most part, I think most fishing scenarios, rough weather gets the fish biting. I think they lose their inhibitions a bit more. I think it changes it generally when you've got a bit of wind, you've got the right barometer, it just makes stuff different. There's probably the noise as well. There's a lot of factors. But, wind direction has a lot to do with fish biting. And down here in Port Phillip Bay, I hate northerlies. We used to always talk about easterlies and, wind from the east, fish bite the least down here, but can't stand northerlies. And that's to do with air pressure and stuff like that. So, but generally speaking, a bit of wind is good.
All right, I'm going to flick past this one definitely to you, Lee. So what's the biggest difference you've found with snapper fishing up the coast as far as Queensland compared to fishing down in Port Phillip Bay?
So in Queensland, the fish are super predators. Northern New South Wales and everywhere, the fish are just big predators. They're offshore, they're on hard reef, and they're ocean fish, and they chase bait fish flat sticks. So that's a big difference. And I think up there, the fish love to get really high in the water column. In Port Phillip Bay, they do tend to sit more on the bottom to mid-water, that's for sure. So, and the fish down in Port Phillip, we catch plenty on lures, Greg, but not like you do up the coast. And certainly jigging, it doesn't seem to be as effective here as it is up in that part of the world. So you do have different sorts of scenarios.
Okay, cool. What have we got here? So can your transducer overheat if it's not in the water?
I don't think it's good to leave them running. I know I freak out every time I realise I've forgotten to turn the sounder off when you stand back with it. What's that ticking sound? They do get hot. I think it would probably have to be on for a while for it to do damage, but certainly I wouldn't make it a habit of leaving them on out of the water, that's for sure. So, because they're pumping a lot of power these days. That's, a lot of power.
And one from David. I'm not sure why it's showing a bit funny on the screen there. What's the ideal speed for sounding? Slower the better, or covering ground?
It's going to matter on your boat. I think we sort of touched on this before, Greg. It's really going to depend on your boat and your setup. So, your boat might be able to sound faster than my boat. So, but generally speaking, a solid walking pace through to a jog. The slower you sound, the better your read's going to be. There is no doubt. There is no doubt. So, but then saying that in Port Phillip, when you're out on the mud and you've got endless kilometres of water that you could be potentially finding snapper in, it does hurt to be poking around really, really slow. So these days, the bonus with the Simrad unit is that you can get this sound a lot faster, that's for sure. But when I get into an area that might look good, you start to mark a bit of bait or I mark a fish, straight away I slow down. I do slow down just to then get a real good read.
Yep. So a question from Michael, dragon snapper are quickly becoming a target species. Have you got any advice for sounding those guys up?
No. What's a dragon snapper?
Give us a bit more information, Michael. Where are you targeting those? I got a feeling there might be a very deep water species, but
I haven't targeted them. I don't know anything about them. So right. Ray, I know Ray Karuna. Ray's asking how fast would we troll snapper in Port Phillip Bay? The answer is slow. Yeah, I've got most of mine just slow. So just like just walking pace, fast walking pace. That's about it. I haven't caught them trolling quick. That's for sure. So, and in fact, I think I mentioned in the podcast, Greg, I've had it when you've got two downriggers and you've got one fish on one and you're fighting that fish and the boat's out of gear and it's hardly moving. Like I'm talking last hour conditions, hardly moving, and then the second lure gets eaten. So, and again, they show that by they like a plastic that's just slowly sinking through the water. They like a jig that's just basically sitting in the rod holder. They like stuff that's just, not too active.
Yep. All right, one final question from Michael, I think, before we go and have a look at some more screenshots. So Michael's question is, if my boat's sinking and I'm tied into a 10-kilogram snapper, what do I do?
Keep fighting the snapper.
You can always swim back to shore and get another boat, mate.
Fine. Hold the rod in one hand and wave with the other. Someone come and get you.
And Sam, this is the final question that we've got on the list, but we'll go back to some screenshots in a moment to give you guys a chance to put a few more questions in. But can you catch fish in gentlemen's hours?
You certainly can. And some of the best snapper fishing, especially in November and early December in Port Phillip Bay, some of the midday bites that we get are just stupid. Middle of the day, hot sun, fish chew their heads off. And saying that too, again, it comes down to if you've got a tide change, if you've got something that's making the fish bite, if the water temperature's right, the fish are just active, that's for sure. So certainly you catch snapper all day. Dawn and dusk are obviously great. If you're like me, you don't like getting out of bed, I'll take the arvo session more than the morning session.
Sometimes they like that warmer water, mate.
Yeah, they do. And that's a factor as well.
Yep. Let's go. We've already seen this screenshot. Do we want anything more?
Keep moving. All right. Keep moving. So that's just a snapper and a micro jig, and you'll clearly see there. What's interesting with micro jigs is a lot of the fish that I've caught, you tend to find the hooks, and it's done there. There's one of the hooks is under his chin, and one's in his lip, and it sort of seems to be a fairly common theme. Versus when you're, often a plastic, they smash it and they suck it right in, whereas the jigs, they tend to just tap away at them and tap away, and when you hook them, they're hooked in the lips. And for this reason, I don't go pulling as hard as I can anymore on my jig tackle, because you just tend to rip the hooks out of the fish. So just fight them like a normal fish and you'll be fine. So this one here, Greg, that's a whole bunch of smaller fish. We've got a bit of structure there and just two bigger fish sitting off to the side of them. And again, that's a pretty good scenario to find. We've got, although the water temp is very, very cold, so this would have been early or late season. So, and again, you'll see I'm going really slow because I know there's a bit of structure there, which is clearly on sort of the left-hand part of the screen. There's a bit of structure on the bottom. So I'm sounding really, really slow, just to probably just pull the boat even out of gear as I've gone over those fish, just to get the best read I can and try and get the best definition I can, because it's cold water and the fish are not that active.
Excellent.
So this one here, that one gets you excited. You've got fish on the bottom. You've got a column of bait that's deep red in colour. So even if I wasn't marking a fish there, which we are, that's sitting up sort of at 16 metres, he's a few metres off the bottom. Even if I wasn't marking a fish there, Greg, I'd be pretty excited just by the density of that patch of bait there being red.
They've been rounded up. They've been squashed together.
And it's flat. See how the bait's flat on the side where the arch is? It's flat. That means that fish is pushing that bait. So the other one I think people need to realise, you don't always mark the fish, because he's only got to just be missed by that transducer beam. But if you mark that, you could go, there's something going on there because of the density of the bait.
Excellent. All right. Now, I have a feeling we might be getting towards the end of our slide deck, mate.
Yeah, I think so. So this one here, Greg, that I've put in is quite simply. So someone asked earlier about, could you just run in auto? The great thing is you can override your auto. So I've got the auto at +3. Okay, so I've overridden what the standards, the factory setting would have come into at this scenario. But what's interesting here is we've got you've got 2 good marks there, so 2 fish sitting very close together. You've got 1 mark that's okay, but there's another 2 fish sitting there, and it's a very weak return. So we've actually got 5 fish there in that shot. Those 2 really weak returns, if I pump my gain up, I would mark them much better. So this is a classic example of tweaking your sound. If you see something, like if you mark just those two really light returns, which are there in between the more solid returns, if I mark those and I go, I reckon that's a fish, I'll pump my gain up straight away. And also go, oh, there's a fish there. So always be prepared and always be playing around with your sounder to get the best out of it in this scenario here.
Yeah. Good stuff. Let me just see if we've got one more. No, that's it, mate. We are done and dusted as far as our screenshots go.
Cool.
I'll turn that off. I'll bring us back on. We do have a couple more questions, so let me just scroll back up through and find them. So questions about burleying. So would you use a burley bomb on snapper in, I think that's supposed to be Western Port?
I tend to use a thing called a secret weapon. You ever seen those, Greg? The red cylindrical thing. It's a trapdoor. So because you got the tide in Western Port, and I like a chunk burley for my snapper rather than a fine burley in most cases. So these things are a foot long, cylindrical, and basically got a big flap on them. And you load them up, you get about 2 big handfuls of burley into them, shut the thing. They're heavy, and you drop them down on a rope. When they hit the bottom, the trapdoor falls open, falls out. So I really like using those. Like using those. So,
I'm familiar with the concept. I haven't used that, but I didn't
really love it.
Brand name.
Yeah. And even if you want to drop them at midwater, you just stop it. And even in Port Phillip Bay, we use them a lot. If you want to just get some burley out of the boat, we'll just drop it down, and maybe midwater, you just give it a jolt. The door will open, the burley will fall out, and you're away.
Yep. So a couple more questions about the burley. I'll bring them up quickly because they're both along the same line. So Adrian's asking how much burley you'd use, and Clint's asking the question, how often do you burley and can you over burley?
I think you can over burley because you certainly up the coast you'll tend to bring in a lot of junk, and even in Western Port and Port Phillip you can too, but Western Port and Gibbs and down Welshpool, and they start pulling in the rays and all that sort of crap. So you start pulling the rays and crap. So, sorry, the kids are starting to fight again.
we've been going a while, mate. They've done well.
They're right.
They've done well.
So you can over burley. Look, like in any burley situation, or just like a good steady stream, or just just consistent. Port Phillip Bay, I like a couple of handfuls every 10 minutes, stuff like that. Same thing, Western Port, every 10, 15 minutes, one of those burley bombs, send that down. So, don't like to over burley though, because you do often pull in the junk, and then I know that happens a lot up in New South Wales.
Yeah. So Sam's asking whether you reckon that you metro fishers will be allowed to go fishing by the 19th of October. Sam, I did invite Dan Andrews along to have a chat about the snapper fishing and when you're going to be able to go, but he's declined, unfortunately.
Really?
Quite busy at the moment. Yeah.
Got a bit on. Look, I hope so. I really, really hope so. So even now, apparently we can put your boat in if you live within 5 Ks of the ramp, but then no one can tell me, but then are you allowed to go anywhere you want? Or have you still got that 5K radius? There's just so many grey areas, and I don't feel like a $5,000 fine at the moment. So
no, the fines are fairly hefty. So
saying that, I feel sorry for the snapper when we are allowed to go, because it is going to be an absolute circus.
You might want to get to the ramp pretty early that day as well.
If you get to, I'll tell you now, down here, Greg, if you get to Patterson River at 4 a.m, you're about 2 hours too late.
Too late, yes. All right. So Adrian's asking you about your favourite bait for Port Phillip Bay, mate.
My favourite bait is fresh garfish. I love garfish, whole, half, whatever. Saying that, pilchards are great, silver whiting, and it's funny, Greg, how at the start of the season, pillies are definitely number one bait when the water's cold, but then as we roll into November, silver whiting and some hard baits like that really start to come into their own.
Yep.
So,
Right. I've got one final question, mate, and then we're going to let you go and get your kids off the bed.
they're right.
When you're sounding, is there a particular way to go? Do you follow a depth contour, or do you just go from shallow to deep and vice versa?
Look, I think it's nice to try and map out your area, and it doesn't matter if it's snapping fishing or marlin fishing or whatever. You want to map out where you are. So if we're on a reef system, I want to map out where the high point is on the reef. I want to work out where the edges are of the reef, and then I want to try and work out where the tide's going to be pushing into. So that's a definite. That is a definite. To take a bit of time to mark and use your GPS. Use your GPS, and anything that you see that you think looks all right, mark it. You'll quickly work out, you'll plot out where the good parts are in, whether it's a reef or a channel or whatever it may be.
And in Port Phillip Bay, as I understand it, mate, the reefs in there are very small, but they multiply every time there's a hard rubbish collection.
They seem to.
That's my understanding.
They seem to. I don't know what's going on. There just seems to be like fridges and stuff like that. So, I don't know.
Yeah.
That's just how it is.
There's a couple more questions come up, mate, before we wrap it up. If you're good to keep going for just a minute.
Sure.
So, Chris, I like this question. I think it's excellent. So, when you're chasing the trophy fish, do you fish differently than when you're chasing the school fish?
Yeah, definitely. So trophy fish, you'll often fish through the night, or you'll fish. We're finding big fish in shallow water, Greg. And generally speaking, if I wanted to catch a big fish in Port Phillip Bay, I will put my time in shallow water. 8 meters or less. Same thing. I like big baits, big fish. I like to try and just do those probably different things that you would do to try and target a big fish. That's for sure. School fish, generally, they're the ones that love to be on the structure. And yes, you'll catch heaps of big ones. You will catch heaps of big ones on the structure. But generally speaking, we spoke about it before, find the edge of a reef system. And those big fish will be mooching around the edges of the reef system.
Yep.
So,
all right, mate. Well, we've got 2 more questions, and then we're going to wrap it up. So, your opinion on fluoro-coloured jig heads?
I think it would probably help. Again, it gives them that little bit of spark to the rig, whether it's, bait fishing, might be a glow bead. If it's a white plastic with a hot pink jig head or a bright green jig head, that could make all the difference. It just gives it that little bit of standout that the fish will see. The other one, I reckon too, Greg, it gives the fish a focal point to aim at. I reckon that's a big part of it as well on a lot of species, and that's why the throat of a hard-bodied lure will be red, or and you get a lot of those bites. It gives the fish a point to aim at, whether it's the weak point on a fish, but it just gives them something to aim at. On squid, they definitely love to hit the head where there's these big eyes. It's a point of focus. So I think definitely, painted jig head is well worth doing on a lure or a plastic.
And very last one, mate, I promise you. So, with set baits, do you use a folding drag or do you use a light drag and let them run?
So, in fishing, there's one thing I can't stand. It's a bit of drag. So, if I'm letting the fish run, I have the least amount of drag on him that I can. Open bail, if it's a bait runner, it's backed off as hard as it can go. Okay, if I'm fishing strike drag, I'm fishing strike drag. Like, I want to bury those hooks. Too many guys, I think, fish a bit of drag, and it's not enough to set the hook, so they get that sort of half thing, the rod buckles over a bit, and then the fish, like, a bit of line comes off the reel, and the fish is gone. I want that tip touching the water pretty well. That's what I want to do if I'm fishing strike drag. Like I said, if I'm fishing bait runner, the other trick that I find, a lot of guys don't like bait runner, Greg, they call that free spool mechanism.
Yep.
What guys do is they tend to get the bite, the fish are screaming off, they pick the rod up, the fish is going your way at 30 k's an hour, so you strike and you're going your way at 30 or 40 k's an hour, and the hooks have got to find their mark really quick. I used to do that a lot. I used to miss a lot, and there's nothing better than a bait runner going off when you're snapper fishing, when you sit there and just howl. I love it. So you'll get much better success. Leave the rod in the holder, click the reel and ticky. And what it does is it just allows that hook to just pull into position, whether it's J hooks or a circle, it just does. The fish is swimming away from you anyway. You know, he's got a bit of momentum going anyway. We use really bloody sharp hooks these days.
Yep.
So that method there, I was going from a 50% hookup rate up to an 80 or 90% hookup rate by just leaving the rod in the holder, turn the handle, click it in gear, you've got him.
There you go, Carla. I hope that helps you out.
Yeah.
So, Lee, that's it, mate. The questions have slowed down. We've had you talking for an hour and a half, mate. We really appreciate every minute of that time. More importantly, we really appreciate all the tips and great advice you've given, all the questions you've answered along the way, and the screenshots you put up today. So thanks so much for coming along and sharing what you know about snapper in Port Phillip and Western Port Bay and using your Simrad to maximum benefit, mate. We really appreciate
As always, Greg, I love doing this stuff, and hopefully if one person got something out of it, then I've done my job.
I can guarantee that lots of people got lots of things out of it. So thanks very much. And folks, of course, we are doing another masterclass in another 2 weeks. We've got Nabil Issa coming on board, and we're going to be talking about Moreton Bay jewfish. So for those that like their dewies, that'll be a top episode as well. So thanks for coming along and sharing some time with us. Thanks for your great questions and your comments along the way. And we look forward to seeing you in the next one.